and bottle washer. We do everything here, John Tilford and I. The beautiful, beautiful exhibit that inspired this series was curated by John and comes largely from the collection of Dr. Michael and Lana Schlossberg, and they're here this evening. We're very grateful to them for their generosity in loaning this to us. Also several other private collections, as well as the High and the Dixon Gallery and Gardens. I'm very excited to know about this. Trampled to Death by Geese is probably the most provocative title and very satirical. I'd like to introduce, before I introduce Troy, I would like to introduce Dr. Lutz, Jay Lutz, who is our professor of French and also Swedish, and who has been affiliated with the museum for the past 27 years. The museum has really only been here for 30 years, so it's been a long time. And officially on the board for 10 years, the advisory board of the museum. And who continues, transitioned through Lloyd Nick's tenure to my tenure, to be the most staunch advocate for this place, and he has on several occasions built an entire course around class, an exhibit that we've done. Very collaborative, and I really enjoy to work with him. So he's going to introduce our speaker today. Thank you, Dr. Lutz.
Thank you. Welcome. Nice to see everyone. I will tell you about how this lecture this evening came about. I am involved not only in French but in Scandinavian, and there is an organization of scholars of Scandinavian studies that meets every spring, and I presented a paper at the conference at the Ohio State University. I put the D in there for you Ohio State people out there. I was asked also by the chair who had received my paper to chair another session because he needed a chair, and that turned out to be a very felicitous opportunity, because I got to hear our speaker this evening, who was giving a paper on Kierkegaard, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. But when it got to question and answer time, what came up was Kierkegaard's experience with a satirical journal in Copenhagen, the Corsair. And once we got talking, it seemed to me that even though we would have to move our point of interest from France to Denmark, that this would fit in very well with the satire exhibition. And of course, Kierkegaard is very connected to France, and France and Denmark are very, very closely connected. So Troy and I got talking, and I invited him to a conference that's going to take place up in North Carolina, where we're both leaving for the conference tomorrow, where we'll both be presenting. And we were able to arrange this lecture tonight to fit in with the exhibition. And I think that in the promotion of the program tonight that you've seen the biography of our speaker. I'll just mention that he has numerous interests, and has come to Kierkegaard through Byron, and he has done major work in the studies of Byron, and now is, and after a master's degree at the University of Mississippi, he's now moved to a PhD program in Scandinavian at the University of California, Berkeley. We're glad to have him tonight, and so I'll let our speaker present.
Thank you, Jay, for the introduction, and thank you, Elizabeth, for inviting me here to speak. My title is Trampled to Death by Geese, Kierkegaard, Caricatured in the Corsair. The life of Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard is said to have been marked by 3 public crises. The first, in 1841, the breaking of his engagement to Regina Olsen. The second, in 1845 to 46, his feud with the Corsair, a Copenhagen satirical newspaper. And the third, in 1854 to 55, his journalistic assault on the Church of Denmark. As we shall see, the Corsair affair would never have occurred without the broken engagement, nor would the attack on Christendom probably have taken place had Kierkegaard not been caricatured by the Corsair. Taking its name from a Parisian paper, the Copenhagen Corsair is descended from the same 19th century French satirical tradition currently on display at the Oglethorpe University Museum of Art in the Sorrow of Too Many Joys exhibition. During the period in which he was enduring the Corsair's wrath, Kierkegaard published his concluding unscientific postscript to Philosophical Fragments. As the title indicates, the book was to bring his feverishly prolific activity as an author to a close. But instead, the Corsair affair changed the concluding unscientific postscript's period into a semicolon. The postscript became the turning point of the entire Kierkegaardian corpus. In order to understand how the postscript took on this significance, we must now turn to the pseudonymous work that directly preceded it, Stages on Life's Way. First, it is important to note that the postscript was authored by the pseudonym Johannes Climacus, with Kierkegaard on the title page as editor, while Stages was published by another pseudonym, Hilarious Bookbinder. Unlike his contemporaries, Kierkegaard did not use pseudonyms merely to protect his identity as author of his works. Rather, he created pseudonyms as fictional characters, each with his own distinct voice and life view. Stages on Life's Way was published by the Bookbinder pseudonym on April 30th, 1845. The Corsair, edited anonymously by Meyer Goldschmidt and Peter Ludwig Møller, customarily offered only satirical criticism of authors and public figures, but the July 4th, 1845 issue hinted that it might be, quote, more enjoyable to eat dry bread and drink water with Hilarious Bookbinder, that being Kierkegaard's pseudonym, than to drink champagne with Mr. Boutius, end quote, the editor of a respectable local newspaper. In his autobiography, Goldschmidt takes responsibility for this effusive praise. Møller, on the other hand, penned a predominantly negative review of Kierkegaard's Stages on Life's Way in Gaia, the aesthetic yearbook he published. Entitled A Visit to Søren, the review takes the form of a narrative in which Møller pays a visit to the eminences of Danish letters residing at Søren Academy. In the home of novelist Carsten McCullers, talk soon turns to the polynonymous philosopher who has authored Either Or, Fear and Trembling, Repetition, Philosophical Fragments, The Concept of Anxiety, Prefaces, and now Stages on Life's Way. But Kierkegaard is not mentioned by name as their author. Møller declares to Hauck and his guests that this philosopher, quote, has not had a warmer admirer than I. But at the same time, I am all the more annoyed at the barren and pernicious use he sometimes makes of his remarkable gifts, which reaches a peak particularly in his last chapter of Stages on Life's Way, end quote. Møller is referring to a chapter entitled Guilty, Not Guilty. There, in the guise of the pseudonym Quidam, Kierkegaard recounts a broken engagement that parallels his own. Kierkegaard even later admitted in his journals and papers that the letter with which he sent back his engagement ring to Regina is printed verbatim in Guilty, Not Guilty. Møller praises the polynonymous philosopher for The Seducer's Diary of Either Or, and what he calls its, quote, philosophy of womanliness, end quote. And well he should, since the Danish scholar Fridtjof Brand has argued convincingly that Møller, who was something of a Danish Don Juan, served as an unwitting model for Johannes the Seducer, the pseudonymous author of the diary. Yet, in his review of Kierkegaard's Stages on Life's Way, Møller continues, quote, but when I picked up his latest big book, Stages on Life's Way, I had an almost uncomfortable feeling. Such an exaggerated, indeed, such an unnatural productivity may be healthy for an author, but for literature and the reader, never. Writing and producing seem to have become a physical need for him, or he uses it as medicine, just as in certain illnesses one uses bloodletting, cupping, steam baths, and the like. Just as a healthy person rests by sleeping, he seems to rest by letting his pen run. Instead of eating and drinking, he satiates himself by writing. Instead of reproducing himself with a fetus a year as an ordinary human being, he seems to have a fish nature and spawns. End quote. So, in a proto-Freudian turn, Møller diagnoses Kierkegaard's graphomania as a sublimation of his sex drive. Indeed, since Kierkegaard denied himself a marriage for the sake of his nascent authorship, writing quite literally took the place of sex for him. Like many of the Danish literati, Møller knew exactly whom he was addressing behind the masks of the pseudonyms, which is to say, he knew guilty, not guilty was essentially autobiographical. As an unrepentant Lothario, Møller could not countenance Kierkegaard's sexual resignation. He writes, quote, "Here one meets a masculine individual who has lost everything that constitutes personality. Feeling, understanding, will, resolution, action, backbone, nerve, and muscle power, all are dissolved in dialectic, in a barren dialectic." End quote. These aspersions cast on Kierkegaard's masculinity are only a prelude to the coup de grace. Møller now alludes to the broken engagement, both in the book under review and in reality. Quote, "And of course, the feminine nature placed on the experimental rack turns into dialectic in the book and vanishes. But in actual life, she inevitably must go mad or into Peblinge Lake." End quote. Darkly hinting at the possibility of Regina's insanity or suicide, Møller upbraids Kierkegaard for his irresponsibility. Kierkegaard, however, had already been quite severe with himself. He had hoped that by posing as a callous rake, he could persuade Regina to dissolve the engagement, but Regina swore that she would die if he abandoned her. If she had succumbed to her own hand or heartbreak, Kierkegaard would have deemed himself her murderer. Although Møller first treats Kierkegaard's writerly sublimation of his sex drive as an abnormal, though harmless means of preserving the author's health, it soon takes on the ominous overtones of the Marquis de Sade. Apostrophizing Kierkegaard before the learned men of Søren, Møller declaims, quote, "If you regard life as a dissecting laboratory and yourself as a cadaver, then go ahead. Lacerate yourself as much as you want to. As long as you do not harm anyone else, the police will not disturb your activity. But to spin another creature into your spiderweb, dissect it alive, or torture the soul out of it drop by means of experimentation, that is not allowed, except with insects. And is there not something horrible and revolting to the healthy human mind, even in this idea?" Although Regina later married Fritz Schlegel, Kierkegaard considered himself eternally bound to her, leaving all of his worldly goods to her in his last will and testament. In fact, Kierkegaard implicitly dedicated his entire authorship to Regina. Either or, the first of the pseudonymous texts addresses her with the choice between the aesthetical and the ethical spheres of existence. To this end, the aesthetic papers of Part 1 conclude with the seducer's diary. Kierkegaard hoped that Regina would conflate him with the novel's despicable title character and never look back longingly on their engagement again. His ultimate purpose was to prepare Regina for ethical and ethical religious existence. And in breaking his engagement to her, Kierkegaard was, he believed, making way for his own engagement to God as a religious poet. Møller, however, profanes both Kierkegaard's relation to his writing and his relation to Regina. Writing, Møller suggests, offers the polynomous philosopher a means of siphoning off excess libido. If this accusation were not infuriating enough, Møller then perverts Kierkegaard's worshipful attention to Regina, warping it into a sadistic vivisection. Kierkegaard responded to these stinging criticisms swiftly and by some accounts devastatingly, publishing a long letter by the stage's pseudonym Frater Taciturnus in the 27 December 1845 issue of the Copenhagen newspaper, The Fatherland. Entitled The Activity of a Traveling Aesthetician and How He Still Happened to Pay for the Dinner, the letter defends the author from Müller's charges of madness and cruelty by stressing that guilty, not guilty, is an, quote, imaginary construction, end quote. It also takes several digs at Møller himself, branding him a sponge who exploits both his host's well-laden table and lively conversation, stuffing his pockets with the former and printing the latter in his aesthetic yearbook. Little did Kierkegaard know that Hauck had permitted Møller to publish his remarks. Nonetheless, Hauck's letter to Møller contained a stern admonition. Quote, "The observations I have expressed regarding Kierkegaard I gladly turn over to you for your use, since I am assured that you will use them with discretion. Meanwhile, you will thereby bring upon yourself a heavy battle with Denmark's most subtle dialectician." Goldschmidt, Müller's fellow editor at the Corsair, reflects in his autobiography, quote, "Without really committing any indiscretions by naming professors from Søren, Møller created the impression that such gentlemen seemed to contribute their authority, and in many respects the whole work was splendid, perhaps the most lively and energetic he had written, but he had caught a Tartar," end quote. He had indeed. In his reply, Kierkegaard writes that Müller's review so, quote, "abounds in factual untruths on the most crucial points. I actually am unable to say that it is my book he is talking about, except insofar as he mentions its title, and in fulfillment reminds me of its prophetic motto, Solche Werke sind Spiegel, wenn ein Affe hineinguckt, kann kein Apostel heraussehen." The German quotation, which Kierkegaard attributes to Georg Christoph Lichtenberg, reads, "Such works are mirrors. When an ape looks in, no apostle can look out," end quote. Yet it was Kierkegaard's parting shot that proved the most consequential for both parties. Continuing to write in the character of Frater Taciturnus, Kierkegaard sighs, quote, "Would that I might only get into the Corsair soon. It is really hard for a poor author to be so singled out in Danish literature that he, assuming that we pseudonyms are one, is the only one who is not abused there. My superior, hilarious bookbinder, has been flattered in the Corsair, if I am not mistaken. Victor Eremita has even had to experience the disgrace of being immortalized in the Corsair. And yet, I have been there already, for ubi spiritus, ibi ecclesia, where the spirit is, there is the church. Ubi Pio Møller, ibi the Corsair." Howard and Edna Hong point out that Müller's association with the Corsair was hardly even an open secret, since Møller himself had already referenced it in a bibliographic article. Still, as Goldschmidt reports, Møller thought that Kierkegaard's revelation shipwrecked his chances of succeeding Adam Oehlenschläger as professor of aesthetics at the University of Copenhagen. In 1851, Hauck was appointed to the position. Kierkegaard scholars, such as the Hongs and Robert L. Perkins, categorically deny that Møller was even remotely qualified to become professor of aesthetics, and he did little to help his cause after Kierkegaard's supposedly devastating open letter. In December 1847, Møller left Denmark, never to return. Little to none of his work was published in Copenhagen. He died of syphilitic encephalitis in France in 1865, 10 years after Kierkegaard's mysterious death in Copenhagen. And Kierkegaard's death was, in fact, 160 years ago to this day. According to Perkins, Møller led a very difficult life after he left the Danish capital. But it was not Kierkegaard's salvo that actually precipitated his exile. Rather, Møller was driven on by the furies of his own imagination, which he, as an upstart and radical outsider, had always felt close at his heels. Kierkegaard, on the other hand, experienced the very real consequences of his letter and its seemingly rash provocation of the Corsair. In retrospect, Kierkegaard offered 5 calculated reasons for why he virtually demanded the rude treatment he received. Firstly, he desired to test whether Goldschmidt admired him and his works well enough not to abuse him in the newspaper. Secondly, since Kierkegaard greatly respected Goldschmidt as a novelist, he wanted to drive a wedge between him and his fellow editor, the detestable Møller. Thirdly, Kierkegaard sought to convince Goldschmidt to resign from the Corsair. Fourthly, Kierkegaard believed that the Corsair grossly misconceived the comic, and he thus hoped that the rag would be destroyed in his collision with it. Fifthly, Kierkegaard thought that he could achieve the desired separation between him and his pseudonymous writings by being degraded in print. In order to understand the lattermost of these goals, a word needs to be said about Kierkegaard's pseudonymity. As I mentioned before, he did not use this device merely to protect his identity. Instead, he created the pseudonyms as a series of fictional characters, each with its own existential sphere. Yet this was not merely a poetic performance for its own sake. To the contrary, several of the pseudonyms contain ethical and ethical religious content, which the reader is free to appropriate. As per Kierkegaard's design, his reader was supposed to independently select a pseudonym to emulate, that is, without reference to the actual author's personality. Kierkegaard sought ridicule as a means of being divested of whatever authority he had as the rumored author of the pseudonymous texts. Only then would the writings stand on their own. Only then would the reader choose in inwardness and as an individual. According to Goldschmidt, Kierkegaard had once told him to devote himself to comic writing. After Kierkegaard needled the Corsair, Goldschmidt resolved to prove to Kierkegaard that he had heeded his advice. For the January 2nd, 1846 issue, he thus composed what he called, quote, a sprightly account of the discovery at last of the secret editor of the Corsair, end quote, who was named after the notorious Venetian raider Coronato the Terrible. The story is illustrated by the cartoonist P. Kleestra. In the cartoon on the slide above, Coronato, after enjoying a glass of punch in the moonlight with the Kierkegaardian pseudonym Frater Taciturnus, confides his secret identity, but with the understanding that the frater shall not divulge it. In the next illustration, Frater Taciturnus spills the story to the newspaper The Fatherland after Møller criticizes his books in the pages of Gaia. So here we see fiction reflecting the reality of the situation. Goldschmidt writes in his autobiography, quote, at the time the bite in my account diminished behind the joking fantasy about Coronato and Frater Taciturnus, and I was so satisfied with it, so childishly satisfied, it may be said, that the next time I met Kierkegaard, I asked him whether the article in the Corsair was comic writing. He replied with a long, drawn-out no. Why not? Because the question cannot be put. In the first place, it lacks respect. Respect for what? For Frater Taciturnus's higher right. There again we stuck to our positions, and after a few words about other things, we parted. End quote. So, after the Corsair's first issue of the new year, Kierkegaard and Goldschmidt were still on speaking terms. The story Goldschmidt composed falls clearly within the bounds of mild Horatian satire, and the cartoons accompanying it are perfectly benign. Nonetheless, Kierkegaard made an indignant public protest, calling the Corsair, quote, a public prostitute, end quote. And Goldschmidt, by his own account, wrote the Corsair's reply to this outburst. Goldschmidt attests that although he was then content to set the affair aside, his colleagues at the newspaper sought to prolong it, introducing an element of bitter Juvenalian satire. Roger Poole has argued convincingly that it was Møller who encouraged Kleestra to target Kierkegaard's body in the subsequent caricatures. Much more so than the articles themselves, these illustrations and their effects were deeply upsetting to Kierkegaard. The next issue of the Corsair, which appeared on January 9, 1846, is also the first to refer to Kierkegaard by name. An article entitled The New Planet apostrophizes him in the first sentence. Here the site of a hitherto undiscovered planet has the small town newspapers acting as though a hawk is flying above them, as you can see on the slide. In the next cartoon, the other planets turn their lorgnettes upon it. Next, the article itself is a dialogue about this new planet between the Corsair, the astronomers Johann Ludwig Heiberg and Christian Olofsson, and Kierkegaard, in which Olofsson calls attention to the fact that Kierkegaard, quote, in order to look like a genius, wears his trouser legs at unequal lengths. If we look closely at the accompanying character of Kierkegaard on the slide above, we can see that, indeed, his trousers are uneven, but that allegation is relatively whimsical in comparison to the assault on his physique. Roger Poole's reading of this particular satirical cartoon is masterful and well worth quoting at length. Quote, the figure is standing facing left, with a cane shoved under the near arm and grasped by the near hand, while at the same time the right arm, crossing the chest, grasps the cane in a double-handed grip just under the chin. This has the effect of raising the whole upper half of the body. The figure is, as it were, measured for its curvature by the straight line of the cane, which forms a rough parallel with the tails of the coat. This trick of using a straight line will be found in many of the caricatures. It has the effect of creating a strong angle at the base of the spine. This is emphasized artificially by the upward pull of the arms and the outward thrust of the stomach, the whole giving an impression of a spinal curvature approaching that of an acute angle. The raising of the shoulders, arms, and chest to accommodate the cane gives the caricaturist the opportunity of sinking Kierkegaard's head down between the shoulders, thus giving the impression that the man has no neck. The head is also, for good measure, pushed a little forward, again at an angle with the trunk. To give the final rhythmic contradiction, the high hat is shoved low down onto the brows, at an angle that even further accentuates the implied curvature of the back and shoulders. Add to this the hat led directly back over the thick collar of the coat, and you have achieved the effect of a man with spinal curvature, a deformation of the top half of his body, and no neck. End quote. This caustic caricature thus begs the question of Kierkegaard's anatomy, and what, if anything, was abnormal about it. While Richard Magnusson and Theodor Hacker speculate that Kierkegaard was born a hunchback, the biographers Walter Lowry and Joachim Garf attribute the curvature of his back to a boyhood tree-climbing accident. Neither do Kierkegaard's contemporaries offer a consensus on his condition or its severity. He is described as high-shouldered, Regine, or with his shoulders hunched forward a little bit, Goldschmidt, or with a crookedness that seemed just on the verge of hunchback, Frederick Christian Sibbern, or somewhat deformed or at any rate round-shouldered, Henry Kurtz, or round-shouldered, Otto Zink, or simply hunchbacked, Karl Brosbøl and Frederick Troels-Lund, end quote. Regardless of what its actual pathology might have been, Kierkegaard's back was a sore subject for him. If he writes of it at all, he does so cryptically, alluding to, quote, the thorn in the flesh, end quote, that prevented him from marrying. Thus, in pointing at Kierkegaard's disability, Møller, if it was indeed he who instructed Kleistrup, had again infringed upon Kierkegaard's unhappy love for Regine. In fact, this relationship was broached explicitly on January 16, 1846, in the next issue of the Corsair. In the cartoon on the slide above, the Corsair refers to the, quote, very artificial experiment with a young girl, end quote, in Stages on Life's Way. According to the newspaper's anonymous writers, Kierkegaard once invited someone over to see, quote, how he had trained his girl, end quote. Poole writes, quote, once again the caricaturist has used the straight line of the stick to emphasize the acute angle at the base of the spine. And once again this is achieved by making a rough parallel between the stick and coat tails, end quote. In conjunction with the cartoon on the following slide, the Corsair quotes page 298 of Stages on Life's Way. Quote, "Today she said to me she believed I really was insane. In a certain sense, it cut me to the quick." End quote. So this is a character of Regina, of course. The Corsair responds, quote, "Poor man, presumably some wicked man had told her about the 26 fake witnesses and about the Randers madhouse, to say nothing of Bizrup." Here the editors of the Corsair conflate the biography of Kierkegaard with that of Michael Leonard Nathanson, a horse dealer known around Copenhagen as Crazy Nathanson. His relatives had had him committed to a Randers asylum several times, as well as to Bizrup, a Copenhagen mental hospital. The Corsair had hit upon the strategy of associating Kierkegaard with Nathanson earlier in the same issue. Reiterating Kierkegaard's statement that he is angered by the Corsair's praise and made happy by its abuse, the editors ask why he so violently raged against them after he went about abusing him. They write, quote, "Only a deranged man could think of showing his happiness in that way. Sorry, my good Nathanson, but you know yourself that it does not quite square up." End quote. Along with the identification of him with Crazy Nathanson, the jests about his lopsided trousers made Kierkegaard the target of widespread public ridicule. Whereas he had once been Copenhagen's leading flaneur, he now suffered rude curiosity and taunts on the walks he took through his beloved city. Catcalls of Søren and Enten Eller, that being either or the title of his first book, followed him wherever he went. There were even plays produced on the stages of Copenhagen featuring laughable characters named Søren. Kierkegaard was enduring, as he put it, a, quote, "martyrdom of laughter," end quote. Reflecting back on the Corsair affair in 1847, he wrote, quote, "To be trampled to death by geese is a lingering death," end quote. While he had once relished the company of the common man in the street, Kierkegaard now found himself seeking solitude in carriage drives through the woods surrounding Copenhagen. Still, he reports that even there he was followed by gawkers. In the aforementioned issue of the Corsair, Kierkegaard's writings are quoted again for comic effect. The cartoon on the slide above is captioned with a line from Kierkegaard's repetition, quote, "I cannot go around dressed like other men. I like to walk in stiff boots," end quote. The next reprints a passage from prefaces. Quote, "Writing a preface is like straightening out the left leg, pulling the reins to the right, hearing the steed say, 'Psst,' and oneself carrying not a straw for the whole world," end quote. Again, Poole offers a valuable reading. He writes, quote, "This time the crooked figure, in the familiar flat hat, is astride a prancing horse. The possibilities of contrast with the outline of a horse must have intrigued Kleistrup at this point. The horse's neck has been artificially deprived of its curve, such that it offers an implied straight line against which the curvature of the rider's back can be measured. The curvature is echoed by the remarkably parallel formation of the horse's haunches behind the rider. Kleistrup had decided where to hit, and he hits that point exactly from now on," end quote. The appendix of this issue contains still more caricatures of Kierkegaard. This whimsical number is entitled, "How the Frater Gets Out of the Way of a Public Prostitute." You may recall that this was the epithet that Kierkegaard used against the Corsair in his reply to Goldschmidt's article. The strange object on the left that the Kierkegaardian stork flees from is a Borlegerjungfru, which is used for setting pavement stones. Ironically, this is not a public prostitute, but to the contrary, its name ends in Jungfru, which means virgin or maid. In his open letter, Kierkegaard had also dubbed the Corsair, quote, "the terrible one," end quote, and referred to himself as irony. Here, according to a line borrowed from that letter, is, quote, "how irony calmly and coolly goes into the terrible one," end quote. The sign on the door reads, "The Office of the Corsair." Poole writes that, quote, "Clestrup, after his successes with the walking stick and the horse's neck, as implied criteria for measuring the curve of the fratter's back, must suddenly have thought of a door frame. The possibilities of contrast between the straight lines of a door frame and the extravagantly curved spine of the ironist Friar Taciturnus," that is Kierkegaard, proved irresistible. And what better door frame than the door frame of the Office of the Corsair? End quote. Next, we see how, quote, "irony calmly and coolly goes out again." So he's thrown out. Next, a bizarre, incomplete portrait of Kierkegaard appears in the January 16, 1846 issue of the Corsair above a satirical column entitled "Friar Taciturnus's Dialectically Authorized Research Center's Advertisements." The editors recommence their attack on Kierkegaard's body in the next issue, dated January 23rd, 1846. The text accompanying this illustration begins, quote, "The gray clouds are silent. The smoke of battle hangs heavily over the terrible battlefield. In an out-of-the-way corner, Friar Taciturnus musters his remaining armed forces and balances the accounts." End quote. According to Poole, Kierkegaard, or Friar Taciturnus, quote, "is thrown extravagantly back from the vertical onto his right leg, leaning heavily back on his right arm, which is supported by the famous umbrella, and it is the right trouser leg that is riding high." End quote. After preening himself on his victory over the Corsair, Taciturnus suddenly finds himself facing his foe. The Corsair addresses him as "great man," but the frater asks to be spared his praise. Yet he will not stand to be greeted as "wee little man" or "mediocre man" either. Poole writes of this caricature, quote, "Once again the straight line of the cane is made to subserve the aim of throwing into ever sharper relief the angle of the back. The cane now forms one side of a virtual square, the other three sides being made up from Kierkegaard's back and arm." The next issue, dated January 30th, 1846, recalls the association between Kierkegaard and Crazy Nathanson. It begins, quote, "Now there's the devil to pay. Two crazy Michael Leonard Nathansons have announced themselves." End quote. Crazy Nathanson barges into the Corsair's office. An editor asks him, quote, "Didn't you write Stages on Life's Way? Are you not Frater Taciturnus?" End quote. After he rushes back out the door, Crazy Nathanson comes to blows with the other Crazy Nathanson, who is obviously none other than Kierkegaard himself. Despite the distractions of the Corsair, Kierkegaard published his concluding unscientific postscript to Philosophical Fragments on February 28, 1846. Appended to it was a first and last declaration, in which Kierkegaard claimed authorship of the several pseudonymous works that had appeared since 1843. Goldschmidt writes that during this period, Kierkegaard met him, quote, "on Muntegard and passed me by with an intense, very bitter glance, without wanting to give a greeting or to be greeted. There was something about that intense, wild glance that drew the curtain, as it were, away from the higher right that Kierkegaard had asserted earlier, and that I had not been able, rather unwilling, to see, although I did suspect it. I was not one to be looked down upon, and I could prove it. On my way home, I decided that I would give up the Corsair." End quote. Goldschmidt, however, may be mythologizing this incident somewhat. By his account, it took place in February, immediately after the postscript was published, but he did not sell the Corsair until October of that year. In any case, the publication of Kierkegaard's concluding unscientific postscript renewed the Corsair's interest in him as a target for satire. An article entitled "The Great Philosopher" in the March 6, 1846 issue mocks Kierkegaard for allowing only Bishop Jakob Peter Münster to praise him. Other readers of the postscript may only be struck mute by its perfection. The cartoon on the slide above presumptuously shows Münster receiving the postscript from Kierkegaard in a posture of adoration. According to the Corsair, when the reader is told that he cannot praise the book he paid 3 riksdaler and 64 shillings for, quote, there is a moment when his mind is confused, and it seems to him that Nicholas Copernicus was a fool when he insisted that the earth revolves around the sun. To the contrary, the heavens, the sun, the planets, the earth, Europe, and Copenhagen itself revolve around Søren Kierkegaard, end quote. With this iconic image, the Corsair affair reaches its climax. Although the cartoon on the slide above was intended to wound Kierkegaard for his presumptuousness, it has over time come to symbolize his indispensable importance to the history of modern philosophy. As the founding father of existentialism, he brought philosophy back from its wanderings in the abstract and the objective to its origins in the concrete and the subjective. That is to say, he turned back from the speculative philosophy of the German idealists to the existential philosophy of Socrates. Whereas Hegel surveyed the vast canvas of human history, Kierkegaard concerned himself with, above all else, quote, the single individual, end quote. But only in a willful misreading, such as the Corsair's, can he thus be deemed egocentric. In the posthumously published article, Kierkegaard writes, quote, the single individual is someone every human being is or can be, end quote. Rather than writing a dogmatic system of the single individual and touring the lecture circuit with it, Kierkegaard realized this idea existentially by being maltreated by the Corsair and his readers. He writes, quote, the single individual can mean the most unique of all, and the single individual can mean everyone. The pride in the one thought incites a few. The humility in the thought repels others. But the confusion in this doubleness dialectically provokes attention. And as stated, this doubleness is precisely the idea of the single individual, end quote. In this cartoon, a comic tension is intended between the ridiculousness of Kierkegaard's crooked figure and the grandeur of the unbounded cosmos that revolves around him. And yet, this dialectic between humility and pride is precisely the doubleness of the single individual that Kierkegaard had hoped to convey through his part in the Corsair affair. Here it is almost as if, in a higher sense, it was Kierkegaard and not Møller who guided Kleistrup's pen. The Corsair took just a couple of more jabs at Kierkegaard, but clearly its interest, and more importantly the public's, was waning. In the April 13, 1846 issue, there appeared an allegorical depiction of the evening newspaper. Its caption states, the evening newspaper, quote, reads unscientific postscript for the first time, end quote. The next is captioned, the evening newspaper reads unscientific postscript the second time. But whether this is intended to be a satire on Kierkegaard or the readers of the evening newspaper, one can hardly say. Finally, a sketch of Kierkegaard appeared in the January 7, 1848 issue, just over 2 years after the Corsair affair began. The caption reads, quote, Søren Kierkegaard and the evening newspaper in a theological tarantella with castanets, end quote. This was the last that Kierkegaard heard from the Corsair, and yet the effects of the affair would determine the course of the rest of his life. With the publication of the postscript, Kierkegaard had intended to retire as an author and become a country priest. The Corsair affair, however, forced him to reconsider this plan. After witnessing the ease with which the yellow press could manipulate mass psychology, Kierkegaard felt compelled to write against this insidious trend. He had renounced being an author, but he could still write as a critic. His next book, entitled A Literary Review, was ostensibly a reading of Thomasina Gyllenborg's last novel, 2 Ages, but Kierkegaard nonetheless seized the occasion to demonstrate how in the present age the public channeled its envy through the press, a phenomenon he termed as leveling. Ultimately, Kierkegaard decided that the political climate in Copenhagen required his unique talents. Instead of strolling the streets of the city as a celebrated author, he would now write a new role for himself. He was to become a martyr. In preparation for this, he gave himself over to writing religious works. Whereas The many pseudonyms of Kierkegaard's aesthetic stage functioned as fictional characters. Anticlimacus, the pseudonymous author of The Sickness Unto Death and Practicing Christianity, served a different purpose. Kierkegaard dared not sign his name to these works because they expressed a Christian ideal that he could not or would not fulfill himself, and thus he once again chose to use a pseudonym. In Kierkegaard's first authorship, irony was the force of repulsion that created a distance between him and the aesthetic pseudonyms. As he was producing their copious output, Kierkegaard used his body to create the image of an idle man about town in order to accentuate the irony. But, as Poole argues, the Corsair's caricatures replaced Kierkegaard's embodied performance in the public's imagination. Thus, a new strategy had to be sought. The second, or Christian authorship, therefore, contains neither romantic nor Socratic irony. Instead, it depends on reduplication, which is a force of attraction. This is evident in number 3 in Practicing Christianity, which is entitled, "From on high he will draw all to himself." The he, of course, is referring to Christ. In Practicing Christianity, reduplication is nothing short of imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ, particularly that of the martyred Christ. Quote, "To reduplicate is to exist in what one understands," end quote, writes the Christian pseudonym Anticlimacus. Bishop Münster, the period's foremost representative of the Danish Lutheran Church, received his copy of Practicing Christianity from Kierkegaard in person. Since the book's thinly veiled subtext is an indictment of the Danish Lutheran Church for its failure to uphold New Testament Christianity, Kierkegaard once again exhibited his talents as a provocateur. On May 2nd, 1851, Kierkegaard asked Münster to answer for a remark he had made, in which he likened Goldschmidt and Kierkegaard as talents. Münster was unable to offer a convincing explanation, and Kierkegaard's journals indicate that being compared to the former editor of the Corsair infuriated him because he thought it raised Goldschmidt's stock while lowering his. Over the next few years, Kierkegaard brooded privately on one thesis. In the Christendom of Lutheran Denmark, quote, "Christianity no longer exists," end quote. He managed to hold his fire only as long as the venerable Bishop Münster was alive. At Münster's funeral, following his death on January 30th, 1854, the theologian Hans Lassen Mattensen read the official eulogy, in which he described Münster as, quote, "a genuine witness for the truth, not only in word and profession, but in deed and truth," end quote. According to Martensen, Münster was the latest link in, quote, "the holy chain of witnesses, which stretches from the days of the apostles," end quote. Lowry notes that witness for the truth had a special resonance for Kierkegaard. Indeed, the term was bound up with reduplication and martyrdom in the dynamics of his authorship. Upon hearing Martensen play fast and loose with one of his most cherished concepts, Kierkegaard dashed off a reply in which he questioned whether Münster's worldliness was true Christianity, and if Martensen's eulogy was in fact the truth. This letter, however, sat in Kierkegaard's drawer for almost a year. Not until the necessary funds had been raised for a memorial to Bishop Münster did Kierkegaard dare publish his attack. The open letter, dated February, appeared on December 18, 1854, in the newspaper The Fatherland. Over the following weeks, Kierkegaard proceeded to write 20 articles for The Fatherland, all attacking the Danish Lutheran Church. He next began to publish his own pamphlet, entitled The Moment, which was so successful that its circulation surpassed that of the daily newspaper. In the tradition of Erasmus's The Praise of Folly, The Moment is, in the words of Lowry, quote, "a godly satire," end quote. In the time that remains, I would like to quote one piece from The Moment and then contrast it with the ungodly satire of the Corsair. Entitled The Theater / the Church, the following appeared in The Moment, number 6. quote, "The difference between the theater and the church is essentially this. The theater honorably and honestly acknowledges being what it is. The church, however, is a theater that in every way dishonestly seeks to conceal what it is." An example. On the theater poster, it always states plainly, "Money will not be returned." The church, this solemn holiness, would shrink from the offensiveness, the scandalousness of placing this directly over the church door, or having it under the list of preachers on Sundays. Yet the church does not shudder at insisting, even more stringently than the theater, that money will not be returned. Therefore, it is fortunate that the church has a theater alongside, because the theater is a rogue, actually a kind of truth witness, who betrays the secret. What the theater says openly, the church does covertly. End quote. So, after raging against the press and journalists during the Corsair affair, Kierkegaard, ironically enough, went about publishing a periodical of his own in the last year of his life. Indeed, the Moment, like the Corsair, was a satirical periodical. But whereas the Corsair used satire against particular persons for the sake of merely amusing its readership, the Moment employed satire as a means towards the end of reforming the Danish Lutheran Church. It must also be said that the Corsair's comic sensibility relied extensively on cartooning, while the Moment is entirely unillustrated. Since Kierkegaard's target was an institution and not an individual, this omission is, in one sense, a practical one. Yet one can also imagine that Kierkegaard, having been the victim of visual satire in the Corsair affair, would have wished to avoid the medium for deeply personal reasons. Thank you. Do we have time for questions?
I think we do. We have some questions.
I have a question.
Yes.
So I'm just thinking about, I was trying to think through the causes for Kierkegaard's frustrations and anger about being represented in the illustrations and the way in which he was. I mean, obviously it seems something intuitive. Any of us would be frustrated if we were depicted in certain ways in illustrations. But I was wondering if it was, I was wondering what you thought sort of was the root of his frustration. Was it because he thought that illustrations were untrue, or because that they accurately depicted who he is and he knew he was not someone to be emulated? Because it's as if he's thinking of illustrations in his writings as mirrors, right? You use that interesting quote, "Ape looks in and the apostle won't look out." So is it that he just thinks he's not worthy of emulation and anything about him that is truthful, right? So I was wondering what you thought, what was the source of his anger at those representations?
That's a great question. I mean, I think we can look at it at these cartoons today, and they don't have the same bite to them that they did in Kierkegaard's day, because political cartooning is something we're all familiar with, and we've seen many caricatures. However, the Corsair was unprecedented in Copenhagen. There were no such satirical newspapers before the Corsair, so it was considered a real terror for some people. In that this idea that you could appear in the newspaper in this sort of distorted form was deeply troubling for many. But I mean, I think it's more the latter, in that he thinks he thinks that this is a somewhat accurate depiction of who he is, and I think there, of course, it's caricature, so it's accentuated, but I think it did really accentuate things that people might have overlooked previously. But now that it's in the newspaper, he can't take a walk outside his home without being mocked in the streets. So in this sense, it was he saw this Corsair as being as something that was sort of inciting this this mob mentality against him, this is why it's so integral to the second part of his authorship, in that he really does go into hiding and gives up the image of the ironic flaneur and becomes sort of this shut-in, persecuted martyr, or at least that's his understanding of himself. Yes.
I find it interesting that they would characterize him rather than his many pseudonyms. I mean, they did as well, but that they would go after the man himself. But maybe that's human nature. I'm just curious to know how many different pseudonyms did he have, and could you tell us them again? They're wonderful.
Sure. There's the first. There are many. The first is Victor Eremita, who was the editor of Stages on Life's Way. The editor of Either Or. His first book was Victor Eremita. And there are other pseudonyms within that work, such as A, the aesthete, and B, or Judge William, who's an ethical pseudonym. He has Constantine Constantius as the pseudonym for repetition. He has Nicholas Nota Bene as the pseudonym for prefaces. And actually, this is a good point you bring up, because I think the pseudonyms, Kierkegaard had his own use for them, which was to create these life views, or these existential spheres that the reader could sort of the readers could insert themselves into. But traditionally in the culture of Golden Age Denmark, the main point of the pseudonym is to create a separation between the public life as an author and one's private life. So it's sort of a buffer between the two. And so the fact that Kierkegaard was writing pseudonymously, but then the Corsair, they start referring to Friar Taciturnus, but before you know it, they're printing Kierkegaard's name in the newspaper, which is a clear violation of the etiquette of these pseudonyms. But of course, Kierkegaard broke etiquette himself, in that he points out that Møller is an editor at the Corsair, which he was doing anonymously, and that was also sort of considered a no-no. So.
Was Kierkegaard prominent in the objects of the satire, or was it just one amongst many people that were satirized?
One amongst many. However, what makes the Corsair affair the major event it is in Danish literary history is the duration that this went on. It went on for a few months, and it really struck a chord with the citizens of Copenhagen, and they suddenly realized that they had this funny character in their midst that they could jeer at and make fun of. So in that sense, he's one among many of the Corsair's victims, but they really put the pressure on him in an unprecedented manner. Yes, sir.
You said something about the mystery of his death.
Yes.
Would you like to elaborate a little on that?
Yes. I'll do my best, because it is a big question mark. I would say it was most likely tuberculosis that he died from. However, whatever his affliction was, he didn't help himself by resting in these last years of his life. When he's writing The Moment, he's working at an even more furious pace. So you could almost say he died from graphomania. That is, he wrote so much that he died in a state of nervous exhaustion, and that at least exacerbated whatever was wrong with him.
You think he had the sense that he had to get it out on paper before he was gone?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, actually, he thought there was a curse on his family that meant that he would not live past 34. And so he writes at a furious pace up until 1845, 46. And then when he's still alive, at first he doesn't know what to do with himself. He thinks he might become a country pastor. But then the Corsair affair takes place, and he says, okay, there's a new. I've been given a new task in that I see that that Copenhagen needs my guiding light. Yes, Jim.
I haven't haven't been able to see actual issues of the Corsair, so I was wondering if you could describe it a little bit as a magazine, in particular in conjunction with this exhibition. Many of the French satirical journals are largely visual, and in particular with Søren, you've got the images and then the very cutting text underneath, which was, you had numerous examples of that. But I also get the sense that there was a good bit of prose text in it. Is that the case?
That is, yes. These, I think all of these cartoons were captioned in at least some way, and some even have lengthy narratives accompanying them. But it's interesting though, because if we look at the journals, it's clearly the illustrations that so vexed Kierkegaard. I think in the written word, he felt that was something he could reply to. He was a master of the written word, whereas this new media of the satirical newspaper, the illustrated satirical newspaper, he didn't know how to respond to it. And as I said, the fact that these illustrations touched on not only his insecurities about his body, but even somehow related to his broken engagement to Regina, it was this deeply personal sense of being violated by these illustrations that really set him off.